So we started defining Ahavat Hashem. We focused on the Rambam last time. So the Rambam, we noted there's two salient points that we should summarize before we move on. One is that the Rambam believes that when we talk about Ahavat Hashem, what we mean fundamentally is intellectual, right? It means emotional, intellectual, whatever you want to say, but meaning love is fundamentally an attitude towards God. Yes? Agreed? The second point was that the attitude that the Rambam thinks is described by love is an emotional love, which is necessarily the function of intellectual understanding. Right? That was point two we saw in the Rambam. The third point we talked about in the Rambam was the balance of whether that love is generated by understanding of nature, understanding of mitzvot, and we talked about the complexity within the Rambam. Right? That's what we talked about in the Rambam. Now, what's left to see is that the other Mefarshim divide. There are others who, like the Rambam, think that Ahava is fundamentally an attitude, but may not agree with the Rambam in what that attitude is exactly, or how you generate it. Meaning they agree that it's an attitude, but they don't necessarily agree exactly that the Rambam does, or what the attitude is, or how you get it. Right? There are others who disagree completely and think that love is not an attitude, love is about action, right? That love doesn't mean feel love, it means act in a way that expresses love, right? And there are those who are going to think that by necessity it means both. Right? So hopefully, because we have a little bit of extra time today because of Mincha, I'm not like, and none of my kids are in school, so I'm not pressed by any of the things that normally press me. Right? Hopefully we can cover as much of this as we can, and maybe more than we normally would, I hope. Okay. So the Maharal seems to fundamentally agree with the Rambam that love that's being discussed here is primarily about attitude, but the love that he talks about is not exactly the same as the Rambam's attitudinal love. I'm going to leave aside the question of how he balances love and fear. I'm going to leave that, but as Raylam highlights, the most central chiddush of Maharal is that he thinks Ahavat Hashem is a function of his version of a cosmic idea of God. Now, you're all looking at me like, what did I just say? Yes, I will, exactly. So, this is Raylam's translation of Maharal. The love of God, the love of man for God that issues from man alone is of no account. For man comes from God, and man returns to him, just as everything must return to him. There is nothing other than God. He is one, and there is nothing else. From this point of view, we can understand love. This is why it is said, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, and immediately thereafter you shall love the Lord your God. Because he is one, there is nothing in existence in the world that is separate for him, for all depends upon and is attached to him, for he is the foundation of all, and that is why love is relevant to God. Now, what did I just say? So, what? Yes, exactly. And now I'll translate it again. So, Rabbi Lam notes that the Maharal thinks that love is about an attitude. It's about a longing for God. But what is the attitude? So he, like Shneur Zalman of Liadi, right, the Balatanya, Chaim Volozhin, thinks that, right, now you could, so this might be, right, he calls it a cosmic, it might be almost panentheistic, right, but basically the belief that everything is God and God is everything, right, that the only real reality is God. So what the Maharal is basically saying is that what we mean by love is to identify or accept or acknowledge that we are really, in some way, partaking of God's reality because the only real reality is God. So love, for when it comes to us loving God, is a declaration that we believe that we really are part of God. And therefore, the way he understands it is, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. God is one, and that's why you should love him. Meaning, by acknowledging that there is only one real existence, God. And therefore, we are really only aspects of that all-encompassing existence of God. The acknowledgement of that is a unique expression of longing to that which is our cause and our source and really us, right? Our only reality. And that's what Ahavat Hashem is. Now, meaning it's the acknowledgement of the fact of God's all-encompassing existence. Right? That's for him what love is. Though Rabbi Lamb notes that elsewhere the Maharal says that it's still not exactly, it's not just acknowledging oneness, meaning there is a certain distance between us and God, while at the same time there isn't. Good luck figuring that one out. But whatever that distance is what allows us to talk about loving God, because it makes us in us and God. Exactly. So like I said, he basically does believe that Ahavat Hashem is about an attitude, but this is obviously a very different type of attitude than the Rambam writes of what the attitude of Ahavat Hashem is. Now, he has based on this, he has a very wild understanding of the Rabbi Kiva story, which is, Rabbi Kiva, we know, dies while he says, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, and he dies when he's saying the word Echad. For the Maharal, why is that true? Because once he fully acknowledged that there is nothing but God, the distance between him and God evaporated. He returned to being part of the one all-encompassing existence that is God, and therefore his soul left and rejoined the all-encompassing existence that is God. And that's what it means that Yatsa Nishmato Be'echad. Do you have a headache yet? I see that you have a headache from this. Yes, in the Chanami. And therefore he writes as follows. Complete love for God is that love in which man returns his spirit and his soul to him completely, to the point that man no longer possesses existence. For he is then in total communion with him. And as Rabbi Kiva said, etc., for this is complete love. When he offers up his soul to God, i.e. in martyrdom, for then he is in utter communion, dveikut, with him. This is the essence of love. Thus we have explained that love appertains more to the love of God than for a fellow human, in that man offers his love for God and is completely attached to him. This is true love. What? And this is, right, so this is for him why loving God expresses itself in martyrdom, right? And that's why, right? So like I said, the Maharal also believes that maybe the average person can't experience this, and that's why Chazal have another explanation of how do you cling to God? How do you accomplish dveikut? By clinging to Talmidei Chachamim, right? Because he recognizes not everyone can directly identify with this all-encompassing unity of God, so some people have to connect to Talmidei Chachamim, through which to then understand in some way and partake of this oneness of God. So like I said, the Maharal believes that Ahava is an attitude, right? Is an emotional approach to God, but unlike the Rambam, who thinks that it's, right, it's an understanding of God, it's passionate love which emerges from recognizing God's greatness through Torah or for nature. He thinks that the attitude is when we recognize that we are really, right, that there is only one real reality, which is God, and we acknowledge that we are essentially part of that reality. So that's a unique type of emotional love or attitudinal love when you realize that there is nothing but him. Okay? You're all looking at me like, what is that? Okay, well, I didn't say it. Okay. Yes, and in that sense, martyrdom is a kiyum of this, is the belief that there really is no reality but God, and therefore you should be willing to give up. Okay, so the Baal HaTanya also thinks that focuses on love as an attitude, but he also doesn't have the same type of attitude, not surprisingly, as the Rambam. The Baal HaTanya believes that there are, both for Ava and Yirat Hashem, there are two types of Yira and two types of Ava. There's what he calls Ava Tiv'it, right? Or Musteret, right? Natural hidden love. And then there's Ava Sichlit. So what he thinks is that essentially the Rambam, right, talks about what he calls Ava Sichlit, which is we contemplate God and come to love him. The Baal HaTanya thinks that the love that we're talking about here is actually the opposite. He thinks there's one type of love which is like the Rambam, which comes from contemplation, but there's another type of love which is, what? That's the lesser level of love. And then there's a higher level of love which for him is the natural love of God, which is inherent in the human soul, but sometimes gets hidden by our averot, by our connection to physicality, whatever it might be. So what he says, Ava, therefore, right, natural love for him is basically, it's what you really want to do, but you're blocked by ego and things like that. So the way that you get to it is self-abnegation and self-annihilation. Yes, is the bittul atzmi, right? Is that basically what you need to do is right? He compares it. Right? He says it's like a flame, right? The flame naturally tends upward, right? Naturally, we really love God, but what we need to do is right? I mean, rational love is, right? He says a lower level love because it's a function of self-concern or self-love, right? The Ava, the natural love is constant, right? He says rational love is lower because it might reflect sort of self-interest, self-love, and also it is only present when you're contemplating it. He wants love of God to be like the opposite of the Rambam, right? Like a parent's love to a child, right? It has to be natural and overpouring. The point is that what you want to do is get to the point where you basically strip aside yourself so that the natural love can express itself for God. Now, he does think that there's value to the Ava Sichlit, but he thinks that's the lower level one. That's like what the average person has, right? But the average person can reach that, but only like the best of the best. The biggest tzaddikim can reach natural love. No, he's like the average person can reach rational love because they can reflect on it. But this higher level where you basically are capable of stripping up, right, the self down so that your natural love overpours for God, he said that's much harder, right? And that's only the select few. So again, we now have three different versions, very different versions. Again, all these believe that love is, right, an attitude, isn't it, right? But they diverge. The Rambam thinks that it's a rational love, which leads to an emotional love, which is based on reflection of Torah and mitzvot. the Baal HaTanya goes to the opposite extreme, which is that the Rambam's love is the lower level love. The higher level love is the natural love, but you have to strip away the ego and mevatel yourself so that it comes out. Right? And then you have the Maharals, which is that the love of God we're talking about is the recognition that there is only God, and somehow that recognition, the longing for the one and only existence, is what love is. Okay, we good so far? You think good?
I don't really want to go much past that.
Okay. Yet, so then Ram summarizes the position of yet another Hasidic thinker, Reb Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, who, he said, does go into certain, right, he's similar in certain ways to the Baal HaTanya, but he has certain distinctions. So he thinks there are three types of love: Ahavat Olam, Ahava Rabbah, and Ahava Zuta, which means small love, minor love. So he thinks that Ahavat Olam and Ahava Rabbah refer to Israel's love for God and God's reciprocal love for Israel. Ahava Zuta is only our love for God. And this Ahava Zuta is similar to what the Baal HaTanya describes as the Ahava Tiv'it. Yes. What do you want to say, Rami?
Who has the other Rabbah?
He thinks Ahava Rabbah is from God to us.
Oh, so we have like the Ahava Olam?
I think, wait, did I get that right? Yes.
So we love the world?
No, not the world, forever. Olam, forever, the eternal love. So then he goes to the different ones, and he says, really, Ahava Rabbah is Avram's love. Yitzchak, who was more with fear, had Ahava Zuta, and Yaakov had Ahavat Olam. So basically, what he says is the following, right? Ahavat Olam is the highest level. Ahava Rabbah is significant, but it's ephemeral. It's like a passionate flame which bursts into flames, which dies. Ahavat Olam is a steady fire that lasts forever. Ahavat Olam means that we love God in whether things are good or bad. Ahava Rabbah is the good when things is the love when things are good. Right, so basically, right, in different versions, he thinks that it is emotional, but he has these different forms of love. And he also thinks that part of love of God is to love other Jews because of their relationship with God, and therefore he thinks that part of it is expanding love in that way. Okay? I'll leave it with that, and you can... I always have a little bit of trouble understanding Rav Tzadok, so yes. What? Yeah, so there is a lot of this Hasidic thought that you have to see yourself in that sense as part of God, yeah. Presumably, yes. Right? Meaning the Baal HaTanya and that is also sometimes talks like that, and yes, exactly. That's why part of why you love other people, because they reflect God in that sense. Yes. Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. So in this sense, though, Rav Tzadok thinks that part of this, right, so Rav Tzadok thinks that part of the kingdom of love is the love of God, but also the love of Israel, and also the love of Torah. And he thinks that the love of God is the source for the other two loves, right? For our love of Torah and love of other Jews. He goes through a whole, history of it. Okay. But that's a lot of different variations on emotional or intellectual love. Okay? But now let's move to the opposite extreme. Shadal, right? Shadal really doesn't like this at all, right? Shadal thinks that the love that we should be talking about here is less intellectual or emotional, but is action. And he really doesn't like pretty much any of the philosophical approaches to love of God. He doesn't like Rabbeinu Bachya, right? So first he challenges Rabbeinu Bachya, who describes it as one of the, right, the Chovot Halvavot, is loving God. His reason is simply because, look, most people aren't philosophically smart enough to understand God, love God, or understand God enough that they can love God in the Maimonidean sense, right? It's just, right? And he thinks that it points, as he says, to an inverse relationship between body and soul, right? Meaning he thinks that this is purely intellectual, and you have to really, like, divest yourself of physicality to get to that point. He also doesn't like the Rambam because he doesn't think, right, he basically just didn't think that it can all be philosophy or science, and he specifically doesn't think that it can be that because he said science changes and philosophy changes, right? So, like, the Rambam thought that the ideal was, like, you know, Aristotelian philosophy, which was based on Aristotelian science, which was wrong. Like, there's a problem with basing it on these, right, on, like, our philosophical and scientific understandings that might change. Yeah. Now, again, he doesn't think that it's wrong to study these things, but he just doesn't like this notion that it's philosophy which can change or that is hard to attain. He also hates Mendelssohn's comment, who also understands it emotionally, right? Mendelssohn says, yes, Moses Mendelssohn, in the Biur, who says that V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha says, be happy in your knowledge of his endless perfection and revel in his faithfulness and oneness and your readiness to do what is good in his eyes, for such is the nature of love. He basically just, right, he just thinks that this is, you know, it's too Greek, right? Right, to just care about philosophical perfection, right? He doesn't like it. So he argues that, right? So instead, what he thinks is the following. He thinks that philosophy, the pursuit of philosophy, is the search for truth. But he thinks that Torah is not about doesn't care that much about the pursuit of philosophical truth. It cares about the pursuit of good deeds and moral behavior. Right? The Torah is a guide to life and not a guide to philosophy. Philosophy appeals to the intellectual faculties, Torah to our feelings, etc. And therefore, Raylam summaries, when it comes to loving God, therefore, we must engage the Torah on its own terms. Just as love is ascribed to God so we can encounter and bond with him in terms we can understand, so does the commandment to love God encourage us to respond to God lovingly by obeying his commandments. For love for God, says Shadal, is not a specific positive commandment, but a collective or general mitzvah, very much like the mitzvah, you shall love the stranger, you shall love your neighbor like yourself. Such a directive must be understood behaviorally. We are commanded to act lovingly, not to love emotionally, for the emotions are in any event not subject to commandment. Okay? So Shadal, I did look it up. This is pretty fair to Shadal, right? Shadal basically goes to the opposite extreme of everyone we've seen, right? Meaning, as I said, the common denominator between the Rambam, Maharal, Tzadok, the Balatani, as different as they are, is that love is emotional, philosophical, attitudinal. Shadal says, no, that is a category mistake. The Torah doesn't speak in philosophy. It talks about action, right? And therefore, love has to be act in such a way that expresses your love. Keep the mitzvot. Now, what's the obvious, right? What is the right? Tzad hashlishi hamachriya beinehem. What is the possible hybrid that will get us out of this mess? Yeah, thank you. That really is, and this is right. I really don't understand the problem here, and this is what Rabbi Lamb writes. Right? Rabbi Lamb writes, look. He says, although this is not the place to analyze his views on the relation of Torah and philosophy, the issue is sufficiently related to understanding that you shall love your God to warrant the comment that his dichotomy between Torah and philosophy is far too neat. In fact, the borderline between them is rather messy and often quite indistinct and cannot be dismissed so airily. Furthermore, his interpretation of Ahavat Hashem lacks theological force. Declaring love a useful fiction hardly inspires religious fervor or the performance of the mitzvot. And on a technical halachic level, he fails to explain the difference between the specific actional mitzvot and the more generalized commandments, as well as to inform us why these latter mitzvot should be reckoned among the 613. Finally, his behavioral conception of Ahavat Hashem leaves one uneasy. By contrast, Maimonides, in offering a more affective exegesis of the verse, not only presents us with a more emotionally satisfying explanation of one of the most significant verses in all the Torah, but also one that accords with the literal sense of the verse. Although we find antecedents to Shadal's interpretation of Ahavat Hashem in Ramban's commentary to our verse, that is not enough to exempt Shadal's view from criticism. That Ahavat Hashem must have pragmatic application goes without saying, but divorcing its expression from genuine religious emotions and profound spiritual sensibilities does an injustice to the pshuto shel mikra, the plain sense of the scriptural passage, as well as to generations of saintly Jews who remain enduring models of Jewish piety and ethical conduct. Yet Shadal has much to teach us in cautioning us against making too easy a synthesis and whatever is the regnant philosophy of the times. We should especially heed his teaching that Torah endures, whereas secular philosophical thought and scientific theories prove ephemeral. Such warning can guide us to the proper kavanah as we recite the key verse to the Shema. Right, so I think Rabbi Lamb in his critique really gives us the tzad, right, the tzad hashlishi hamachriya beinehem, which is, it's too much to claim, right? It goes too far to claim that love of God is only action, but it is also obvious that love of God it can't only be a feeling or an attitude. Right? It must be that the simplest understanding of this is that love of God is get yourself to a certain emotional, intellectual place such that the natural outcome of that will be action. So it may be that the mitzvah of Ahavat Hashem, like the Rambam says and the Tanya says, is fundamentally attitudinal. But Shadal is right to remind us that we can't remain at the level of attitude and intellectual statements of belief, because then that clearly is not the Torah's belief. Right? The Torah very much does integrate thought, emotion, and action. And that seems to be, right, the combination of them, right? On the one hand, yes, there's a special obligation to have the attitude of loving God, and maybe that is the mitzvah, but to get caught up in that and think that it doesn't need to express itself in action is very much, in that sense, to miss the point of the way the Torah understands love. Okay, so that is Rabbi Lamb's synthesis, which I think fundamentally is in that sense correct. Yes, Yosef. He doesn't quite combine them, right? Rabbi Lamb wants to combine it by saying the mitzvah of Ahavat Hashem is attitude, right? But it's obvious that it's attitude, that it's not meant to be attitude by itself. There is a special mitzvah on attitude because that's what makes this distinct from the other practical mitzvot. But Shadal is right in the sense that Ahavat Hashem must express itself pragmatically, or that's not quite Ahavat Hashem, right? If it remained on the level of attitude, that would reveal that there's something lacking. So it must be integrated into action. It might be primarily attitudinal, right? Because that's what makes it distinct from the mitzvot ma'asiyot, right? From the active mitzvot. But but action must be the end goal of this attitude, or it's not Torah. No, Shadal doesn't like attitude. Shadal doesn't think you can ever command attitudes. Who? Does who? Oh no, he doesn't get into that here, right? Now, obviously, it could affect it, right? Depending which attitude you think it is, it definitely could affect which types of mitzvot are most functions of it. Okay, now Elam's last discussion here is, and hopefully we'll get through this, is that all of this forces him to ask the question, does God need our love? Right, which is the last philosophical question that he wants to reflect on. Meaning, what does it mean that we should love God? Like, why does God need us to love him? Doesn't that imply some sort of lack in God? And doesn't this get into our problems of anthropopathism and anthropomorphism? You know the difference between anthropomorphism and anthropopathism, right? Anthropomorphism is ascribing body to God. Anthropopathism is ascribing human emotion to God, right? The Rambam thinks both are wrong, right? But he thinks that anthropomorphism is worse than anthropopathism, but they're both wrong. Okay? Yes, I remember once that. I just remember sitting there once. I was at my parents' once for Shabbos, and Rabbi Dov Linzer was scholar in residence at my parents' shul, and for some reason he gave the drasha on Shabbos morning, a 25-minute, very complicated philosophical drasha on the difference between anthropomorphism and anthropopathism and why both might be problematic according to the Rambam, but one is more problematic than the other, and what that tells us about both of them, which my parents' shul was not the right shul for that. Oh my God! Look, it was a very. I appreciated it being a philosophy major, right? I'm not sure how many other people appreciated it. It was very good, but yes, I just remember there being some blank looks on people's faces at the 8 o'clock meeting at my parents' house. Yes. Okay. So he notes that, yes, according to the Rambam, right, the Rambam, he takes it as a given, will take it as heretical and sacrilegious to talk of any mutual dependence. We know that, yes. So the Rambam obviously will just answer all these questions by saying, no, God does not need your love, right? It's just a figure of speech. That's it. But Rabbi Lam notes that as much as, you want to avoid this anthropomorphism or anthropopathism, we should try to take the language seriously, which is that love, whatever you think it means, does imply a certain codependence, right? It does. That's what the word... and he says this is true even if you talk about the emotional predecessor of love, which is sympathy, right? Where sympathy, right, the ability to understand another person and feel, right, even if you don't feel what they're feeling, but to appreciate it. And he notes that, at this level, there does, right, many texts do talk about God at least having, whatever it would mean, some sort of sympathy for the human predicament, right? So he notes that, right, God regrets, whatever that means, creating man because we were, right, we messed up the world. He feels grief, quote unquote, right? There's other language that does talk in this way, God seeing our suffering, or even the Mishnah and Sanhedrin, right, quotes Rabbi Meir as saying that when a human being suffering, it's as if the Shekhinah says, my head hurts, my arm hurts, right? That there is, right? And he notes that, right, the Gemara tells the story between the sun and the, right, the machoket, the sun and the moon. Remember the sun and the moon machoket? Right, the moon, right, the midrash, right, that the moon said, right, originally the sun and the moon were the same size. Correct. And the moon said you can't have two kings. So God said, you're right, shrink yourself. And then the midrash says something astonishing in the Gemara, in Chulin, which is that the reason that you bring a chatas on Rosh Chodesh is because God says, bring a chatas on my behalf, because I sinned by making the moon shrink himself, right, by diminishing the moon, right? So God, so to speak, is sympathetic to the moon's plight, and tells you to bring a korban. Now, obviously, this is very anthropomorphic. Well, so he notes that that this is right. So yes, the Aruch says that no, it's Bnei Yisrael who need sins. Right. This is it just means that God set up the time to bring a chatas for Bnei Yisrael. Right. They totally reread that Gemara. On the margin in Shavuot of the Rif, it says, this is one of the secrets of the Kabbalah, and heaven forbid that it be taken at face value. Right? It is very problematic. And Roy Lam says, yeah, obviously we don't take it literally, but what the Gemara does seem to be getting at is that we're supposed to at least imagine that God has some sort of sympathy in the sense that he appreciates the pain of the other. Whatever that means, right? Now, right, the Kabbalists obviously think that in our tefillah we actually do something for God in a certain way, right? That's the whole notion of the fixing of the sefirot and things like that. And he notes that at some level, not only do we talk of God having sympathy for us, but we have sympathy for God, right? That's what the Kabbalists believe, right? That God is in a certain sense incomplete, and we're trying to fix the sefirot and stuff like that, right? So there is traditions like this, and right, we he goes through a lot of stories here too, but his point is that in the end of the day, the Torah, whatever it means, does seem to want you to take this notion of love somewhat seriously, at least in the sense that at some level we're supposed to perceive some sort of dependence, that we need God and God needs us. Whatever it means, right, is, unclear. But, right, there is this idea of mutual sympathy, kivyachol, a million times. Now he says, of course, it doesn't mean that God really needs us in the same way, right? The assumption of the Rambam and the Baal HaTanya, etc., was that God is fundamentally different from humanity, right? That he's transcendent, that he doesn't really need us, and the like. But he says, in the end of the day, the metaphors that Tanakh uses to try to get us to think in a certain way do try to make us at least think in these notions of dependency. And again, he says a million times that we should be wary of actually taking these literally, right? He notes that obviously, Wisher God has pointed out when it comes to Avodah Zarah, right? God is described as having emotions, right? As being angry and jealous and the like, because we're married to God. So, again, right, Lamb says a million times, we must be wary of taking such images and expressions too literally. For though the rigorous condemnation of any and all anthropomorphisms and anthropopathisms of the Bible and Talmud may sometimes lead to an excessively depersonalized deity, the opposite tendency is even more dangerous. It may well lead us to form an infantile conception of a corporeal God, blurring the differences between the divine creator and his human creatures, right? So Lamb's basic question is as follows. On the one hand, at a deep philosophical level, obviously God doesn't need us. But on the other hand, the Torah goes out of its way to use language that makes us feel, right, or approach God as if he needed us, right? As if our sympathy for him or love for him did something, right? And this is like the great paradox. So what Lamb wants to try to deal with is how can we arrive at a position that satisfies both the theological demands of monotheistic purity and the psychological need for putting a human face on religious experience. So Rav Leon de Menina of Italy in his Ari Nochem provides a useful analogy in a slightly different context. A sailor on an incoming vessel approaches the pier and throws his line to those who stand at the pier. After they tie the line to the pier, the sailor tugs on the line in order to pull himself and his craft back towards the pier so that he can disembark. To the onlooker, the sailor is pulling the pier toward himself, whereas in fact he is pulling himself to the pier. So when we speak of God's needs for compassion or companionship or love or relief from distress, we are in reality pulling ourselves to him, i.e. expressing our own deepest feelings and needs and projecting them upon him as an act of communion as we cleave to him. For a more sophisticated explanation of this point, it would be useful this time to revisit an important distinction that engaged us earlier in chapter 7. The first verse of the Shema, according to Shneur Zalman and Chaim of Volozhin, alludes to the exclusive ontological reality of God. That is, nothing else can be said to truly exist. All that is non-divine is mere illusion. But the verse Baruch Shem Kivod that we recite immediately afterward, in keeping with rabbinic tradition, assures us that the world we inhabit does exist, and so we must act accordingly. Borrowing a distinction first formulated by the 16th century Tzfat Kabbalist from Mordechai Cordovero, Shneur Zalman and Chaim of Volozhin explained that this contradiction is resolved by assigning the Shema verse to Mitzido, from God's point of view, and the rabbinic verse, meaning Baruch Shem, to Mitzidenu, from our point of view. Thus, in the most fundamental sense, reality can be ascribed only to God. However, it is his will that we mortals, bound inextricably to this web of illusion, close our eyes to the cosmos' ultimate unreality and act as if it were all real. So it is that we first affirm the abstract proposition that nothing but God exists, that our world is devoid of all ontological validity. Then we return to our everyday world of sensate, experience, and human needs, and declare that we are both real and worthy to serve God. We accept this world as real because of our human need to do so, and because God has willed that we act this way, as if God is in heaven and we are on earth. In the course of living our lives, mitzidenu, we thus confront and engage God as if we were real beings participating in true existence. In a similar fashion, we acknowledge that from the point of view of ultimate reality, understood fully only by God, and only asserted philosophically but never fully comprehended existentially by human beings, we can never attribute such imperfections as need, injury, vulnerability, and loneliness to God. God is beyond all emotion, including love. Nevertheless, in our daily lives as thinking, feeling, and acting beings, we relate to God psychologically as a sentient, feeling, reacting being. Approaching God this way respects Onkelos and Maimonides' stricture against anthropopathisms and certainly anthropomorphisms, yet allows us to go beyond the realm of metaphor, to nurture our relationship to God in an existentially and psychologically more meaningful way than merely poetic or metaphoric analogy. The Cordoverian paradigm resolves the conflict between the philosophers and those ordinary religious folk, and some extraordinary ones as well, for whom prayer is more than poetry and love more than metaphor. It allows us to keep our hearts without losing our heads. And it tells us that, yes, God needs our love as surely as we need his. If this understanding emerges as only from our point of view, so be it. For it is quite presumptuous and impossible to view anything from God's point of view. So that's a bit of a long Rabbi Lam quote. But Rabbi Lam's argument is essentially that maybe, philosophically speaking, at the ultimate level, the Rambam is right, that God doesn't need us at all. But the fact that the Torah uses metaphor that implies that he does is to legitimate the human experience in which we feel like we're in relationship with God. And even though we know that God doesn't really love in the way we think of love, still, we're supposed to imagine it that way in the sense that by imagining it that way, we can actually forge a real emotional relationship with God. So that's Rabbi Lam's attempt at really squaring the circle here. I think you could do it in other ways. But that is Rabbi Lam's way of dealing with it. That has led us to the end of the first pasuk of V'ahavta. Rabbi Lam really does run through the rest of it, and we will do more than Rabbi Lam, but Rabbi Lam's treatment of the first few psukim is so thorough and so excellent that I thought we had to take it up. We will move on in V'ahavta, and then move to V'haya and Vayomer. I have a few things that are totally not related to Rabbi Lam planned for as we move on, but I really didn't want to go through Rabbi Lam because, you have to admit, this is a phenomenal work that he so carefully goes through just the first part. What? It's unbelievable, and it gives you real. And look, he used it as a springboard to really understand different versions of Jewish philosophy, and I think it does that effectively. But we've gotten through the densest part of it. Shema and the first pasuk of V'ahavta. After this, we will move a little bit more quickly, so we will eventually cover at some level of Shema. Yes, exactly. More than one word per week, maybe 3. Yes, very good. Okay, so let's take a 5-minute break until Mincha, and remember Mincha is at 1:00 because of candle lighting. So